globally. And we find that many of the energy topics, such as clean cooking, open access, electricity cooperatives, tariff design, and so on, are usually discussed separately in the global north and global south, but rarely on the same platform on an equal footing. And so this is the first webinar in a new initiative called the North-South series, where we host speakers from across this divide to share their experiences on common issues. And so today's webinar will focus on responses to the raising electricity costs globally, and in particular, how Kenya, India, and the United States are considering equity and affordability strategies in the design of electricity tariffs. And so before I introduce the speakers for today, I welcome my colleague, Dr. Diana Hernandez. She's the co-managing director of the Energy Opportunity Lab and associate professor at the Mailman School of Public Health to deliver the opening remarks and set up the context as to why electricity rates are important in the discussion on energy poverty and insecurity. So over to you, Diana.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vivek, for moderating and also for designing this series, really. This is in some ways in the spirit of what we've been aiming to achieve in the Energy Opportunity Lab, because in many ways, what we're focusing on is this intersection of energy access and energy affordability. And one of the things that I have come to understand in participating in the kind of core research on this topic is that even when people have access to energy, meaning they're connected to the energy resources so that they do have access at home, affordability actually becomes a huge challenge in people being able to easily turn on the lights, turn on their thermostats, turn it up or down according to whether or not it's too hot or too cold outdoors. And so, or whether or not they are kind of foregoing other necessities like food, medicine, transportation, other things that are necessary for a decent life when they can't afford their utilities. And so what we're really thinking about are what are the cross learnings? How do we understand the developments of different policies and practices and real milestones and achievements when it comes to promoting energy affordability, where those strides have been and where that work is actively kind of under consideration? And also, what are places kind of doing to promote that, where the goal is also to lift up folks and get them to have energy access? We know in the US, for instance, that over 30 million households are energy insecure. And that has different manifestations. Sometimes that has to do with people not having the kind of energy infrastructure in their homes to support access. In many ways, the kind of core components have been around affordability. And there are two ways that this has been mostly addressed. Well, three ways. The first has been through bill assistance and ways of kind of modifying what people pay through utility discounts, for instance. In the US, another way has been by focusing on the efficiency and performance of buildings and housing, kind of the built environment of housing. And the other piece has been coping. So like all of the ways in which people are actually doing work to reduce their own costs. But we haven't looked further upstream to the tariffs part and to rate design. And that is what this conversation is really about. It's going more upstream than the bill in terms of like the actual bottom line, to think about how much people are charged by kilowatt or British thermal unit, why that is, and what are the kind of paths forward to make it more accessible and more affordable for households around the world. And so with that, I really am excited about having this conversation and partnering with Vivek on its unfolding. Welcome, panelists, and thank you so much for those of you in the audience.
Great. Thank you so much for laying all of that out, Diana, and I invite you to, moderate this discussion with me. And so without further ado, I I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for this webinar. We have Simran Grover, who's the founder and CEO of the Center for Energy, Environment, and People based in India, and Madison Herzog, who is the Energy Policy Advisor at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice here in New York City, and Daniel Kipto, who is the Director General of the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority in Kenya. So we have different perspectives here, regulators and advocates and local government. So we really look forward to having this conversation. And so, this is a webinar, and for the benefit of the participants, I just also wanted to lay out what we hope to discuss today, so you know what's coming. We'll first lay out sort of the tariff design process in each country, followed by briefly the types of impacts that people face with respect to affordability. We'll then spend substantial time on successful policy strategies that have been implemented to address this issue, followed briefly by what has really not worked so well. So please, for the audience, please share your questions through the Q&A option, and we hope to have some time at the end for them. So let's get into it. Maybe starting with Madison, and then Simran, and then Daniel. So first question: what is the basis and the process for designing electricity tariffs in your country? And I recognize, based on sort of historical roots, that process may be different. And so specifically, what regulatory pathways, if any, do you have to go through to consider equity and affordability in the rate-making process? So Madison, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So I would say that it's essential to understand how rates are set to understand what informs the tariff. And the first aspect is the revenue requirement, which is how a utility makes its money. And that's the fundamental role, is to ensure that the costs incurred by the utility are justified, customers are charged just and reasonable rates, and the shareholders have what is considered a reasonable opportunity to receive a fair return on investment. And so all of these aspects get lumped into the revenue requirement formula, which is determined by taking the costs the utility is allowed to recover, which is operation and management, depreciation, and taxes, plus the shareholders' allowed rate of return. And so the rate of return is really based on the utility's capital structure, but the most important aspect of that is what goes into rate base, which is the amount of money the utility is able to recover from the customers themselves, or to look at it in another way, what we are charging customers. And the primary policy that underlies that is that the costs the utility can recover from ratepayers must be just and reasonable. And that kind of means that the assets that are being used are used and useful, and there are prudent investments. In terms of the regulatory pathways that we have to consider equity and affordability, each state in the US has a Public Service Commission, which is the regulatory body that oversees the utilities. And among their duties is to provide a formal forum for the utilities to initiate rate case proceedings. And in these proceedings is where we see the pathway to integrate equity and affordability, because it gives us the opportunity to really review what is driving the cost of charges being passed to customers. And it also provides us a window into the cost the company is incurring, and allows stakeholders like the city to propose unique cost sharing mechanisms. For instance, like that certain energy affordability programs be funded in part by shareholders.
Great. Let me have one follow-up question on that, and then we'll get to Simran. You said a couple of times the just and reasonable standard. Could you speak a little bit more about the interpretation of that? It's just and reasonable for whom? For the utilities, for the customers, and how who balances that equation, and how has it worked out in the recent history?
Absolutely. So the just and reasonable principle is pretty theoretical in that it is intended to ensure that customers are receiving energy that is reliable, but they are also only paying for the energy that and services they are using. I think something that is complicated about the just and reasonable principle is that it doesn't consider the stacking costs of the utilities. We set these rates and the cost of rate base and therefore the cost to customers in these proceedings. But outside of the rate case proceedings, the utilities have the authority to surcharge customers for certain things, recover deferred costs at certain times of the year. And all of these discrete costs really stack up on top of each other and have resulted in my opinion, what is not a just and reasonable rate design in some ways.
Got it. Thanks, Madison, and we'll probably come back to that towards the end. Simran, what about in India?
Thanks, Vivek. So since India, I think, borrows its model from World Bank, and which is essentially also the US model, there are a lot of similarities in the design process, right? For instance, we also have similar structure in terms of regulatory commissions. We have, the sector is largely unbundled into generation, transmission, distribution. We do have a very well definition on what's a sort of a reasonable return on equity, right? And it's sort of very well defined in the Electricity Act itself, especially when you are talking about rate which is determined by the regulator and not by competitive bidding, right? So it varies between 15%, I believe, if I'm not wrong, from generating companies to about 16% for distribution companies, considering that, the risk buckets of distribution, transmission, generation are quite different, right? We can debate, whether those sort of risk appropriation and corresponding ROEs are justified or not, but that's essentially the structure. So it's the process is very well defined within the Electricity Act 2003. That is when the Indian utilities unbundled in most states, not all, and established the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission and State Electricity Regulatory Commission. Electricity is a concurrent subject, so it falls under both central and state jurisdiction. But when it comes to electricity distribution, which is retail electricity sale, it's largely the domain of state electricity regulators, right? Now, these are fortunately, I think, set up as some of the most democratic platforms where citizens can also address their concerns and around issues of affordability, but also larger issues of safety, of quality of supply, etc. Right? What also informs, other than what Madison has already sort of laid out, in rate determination can be quite complex, since electricity in India can be a very, very political issue. I'm sure it's true for US also, but I somehow working on the ground, I see we feel it very intensely, I would say, right? So Electricity Act allows for rate differentiation based on the end use. So we have different stakeholders. So you have, basically different types of consumers, industrial, commercial, and agriculture, and then domestic consumers, etc. And then there are subgroups also. There are large industries, there are small industries, and this sort of the interpretation of the act and so sort of implicit tariff rationalization principles does vary from the state to state. I'll largely speak from the Rajasthan perspective, where we do end up of the large powerful groups doing lobbying for themselves, right? And the whole electricity sort of design is extremely complex in Rajasthan. There are multitude of consumer categories and subcategories. I think if you do permutation combinations, we are looking at somewhere around 70 to 80 sort of differential tariffs at the end. So a high amount of complexity. What does that achieve? Is something we can discuss. Yeah.
I may have thought of 8 or 10, but 70 to 80 does sound like a big number, and that's really complex to administer. So okay, we'll get to Daniel and then circle back. Daniel.
Thank you. I think for us in Kenya, the methodology is more or less the same. We do apply a rate of return methodology. I think the question that has just been spoken to by Madison, particularly around just and reasonable, for us in Kenya, we've hardwired this into our legislation, which is our Energy Act. And the question around what is just and reasonable, I think first is a tariff that allows, one, the utility to maintain financial integrity. I think the second principle is to allow the utility then to be able to attract capital Third is for them to be able to operate efficiently. And lastly is to allow compensators to assume, to compensate the investors rather for the risks that they fully assumed. And that's hardwired in the legislation. In terms of our energy ecosystem today in Kenya, we operate a single buyer model. We have a utility that's majority owned by the government, being the sole distributor. We have multiple generators, both IPPs, independent power producers, and also majority owned by government generating company. In terms of the methodology, in terms of the tariff design, we're able then to look at our demand forecasting and be able then to come up with the building blocks in terms of your tariff computation. And I think maybe what would be unique, similar to what Simrana just spoken to around our customer categories. We have our industrial category, we have our commercial, small commercial category, and also have our domestic category. And we then have cross-subsidization within bands. And as Simrana has really said, the tariff methodology is well defined, but the decision-making process can be very emotive, can be very political. And what we'll also have in our legislation is that consumers will only pay for the risks that are prudently, or costs rather, that are prudently incurred. In terms of the methodology, I think the methodology is very well set out. We have a tariff guideline policy. We are now in the course of developing regulations that will also codify the process of the process of reviewing and setting tariffs for us as the regulator. But in Kenya also, we have a unique requirement, which is a principle hardwired in our constitution as well, of public participation. So for us as a regulator, when we go out and are able then to go out to the public, we must be able to have the utility go out with us as the regulator for public hearings across the country to get buy-in in terms of the tariff that we wish to publish. In terms of what objective do we look to hit in our tariff review process, I think one is the economic objective in terms of ensuring that in the short term to long term, we have financial sustainability of our sector, our utilities have a good financial health, but there's also the social policy objective as well. We do have cross-subsidization, as I said, within bands, but for the domestic category, for instance, in Kenya, we have the lifeline tariff, where we try and achieve a social objective by cushioning those who are at the bottom of the pyramid and having those who are in the middle to upper class be able to cross-subsidize along the domestic band. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I know from the Indian perspective that some of that cross-subsidization happens as well. And Madison, I just wanted to pick you up on that point as well. How much of that do we see in the US in terms of cross-subsidization of tariffs across different customer categories?
That's definitely a major component of the tariff design in the United States. Similar to what the other panelists have said, there are specific customer classes that each utility uses to socialize specific costs across all customers. So we have residential, commercial, industrial, and then there are subcategories of customers within these three very big classes. So we could have residential, like low income, residential firm customers, commercial firm customers, and those rates are different, again, depending on the end use.
Okay, let me pose a quick question to all three of you. Who subsidizes whom in this process? Which customers tend to subsidize which type of customers? Just want to see if that's common as well across all three. Madison.
It really depends on what occurs in the rate cases and what costs we're incurring, I would say. We try, though, to spread costs levelized across all customer classes so that one customer class is not disproportionately burdened.
Got it. Simran?
Yeah, so it varies from state to state, right? Theoretically speaking, commercial and industrial categories should be subsidizing domestic categories and agriculture. Agriculture tends to be even more political than domestic tariffs, and it's typically highly subsidized, most cost subsidies, as well as direct government subsidies. Now, similar to Kenya, we also have lifeline electricity sort of encoded within the act itself. There is jurisprudence on this also, and then state regulations have their own views, right? For it's not strictly, I think, lifeline access can differ from geography to geography, since Indian sort of agroclimatic weather is very, very diverse. Right? You have mountains in the north which can be very, very cold, and I'm living in sort of Rajasthan, which is very, very hot. Right? So energy requirements both within the seasons can be very, very different, which will also mean that the minimum threshold electricity that a household would need will also be different. So unfortunately, regulations and the policy have not really taken that outlook. But Rajasthan, in past few years, redefined the benchmark to 50 units, and then it's taken up to sort of 100 units, and Delhi, for instance, 200 units. Many states are, because of political reasons, also no denying it, taking this sort of pushing the threshold to 200 units. In terms of who subsidizes who, theoretically, yes, industrial tariffs and commercial are the highest in Rajasthan, and commercial account for about 9.5% in terms of number of connections, but 7.5% in terms of consumption. Largest consumption share is agriculture, then followed by industrial, and then domestic. Right. Now, structurally, we have a two-part tariff, right? So what you are paying, and then there are telescopic tariffs, right? Which means that at let's say for 100 units, I am paying X amount. For next 100 units or next 150 units, I might be paying 1.5. So that's what we call a telescopic tariff, right? It basically ensures affordability at lower consumption level, right? But being a two-part tariff, it also means that, and then there are other things, there are cess, there are electricity duties, which are basically instruments for recovering funds to subsidize direct subsidies, are also recouping some of the losses or regulatory assets that have been set up in the past. So what we see in Rajasthan, for instance, or something we have been advocating for, is that if you look at the absolute amounts, the richer consumers, especially the domestic, end up aggregating a lot of subsidies, right? On an average basis, actually, we see that the lower consumption categories pay the highest tariff in Rajasthan. Their variable energy charge might be the lowest at 3.5 rupees, right? But their fixed charges are very, very high. Now, let me give you a very simple example. I am consuming, if I'm consuming anywhere between, let's say, 400 to 500 units a month, I'll be paying a 400 rupees fixed charge. Right now, that is against roughly around 10 kilowatts of my domestic load. Right? That comes to 40 rupees per kilowatt. Right? Against this, of sort of a very poor household will be paying 3.5 rupees unit against an average price of 7 rupees per unit. But they are paying a fixed charge of, I believe, 50 rupees or 75 rupees. And although their sanctioned load will be 1 kilowatt, their actual load will be less than 500 watts. Right? So now that person is paying anywhere between 100 to 150 rupees per kilowatt of a fixed cost versus mine of 40 rupees, right? So those sort of inefficiencies in tariff design definitely exist, not across all states. That is particular case of Rajasthan. It might be, but most states are more progressive in terms of, transparently and duly subsidizing the poor households.
Okay, great. Next, Simran. And Daniel?
Yes, I think in Kenya, we do have the small commercial, the SMEs, as it were, cross-subsidizing large industry, and we'd also have a cross-subsidy within the domestic category. Because of the political sensitivity and also because of the technical nuances around those who are connected at a higher voltage, when you look to your commercial and industrial customers, they have a demand charge. Kenya had a fixed charge with their domestic customers, but we then, as a country, decided to do away with that, particularly because of those at the bottom. So you don't have any fixed charge for domestic consumers, but within the domestic consumer category, you have the cross-subsidization, where we have the lifeline category, which is probably from 0 to 100 units. We have brought it down in our last tariff review to 0 to 30 units, so that we can protect those at the bottom. But within the domestic category as well, Kenya we don't have 100% electricity access. There are those who are in the far-flung off-grid areas who are served by standby generators operated by the utility, who are cross-subsidized from amongst the domestic category band. When you look at your small commercial, they in the last tariff review bear the biggest brunt, because then they're cross-subsidizing industry because of the imperative to keep the cost of manufacturing low, and also because of the nuances around lower losses at connection at a higher voltage. So in Kenya, has been really striking the right balance from a commercial industrial standpoint to keep Kenya more competitive, protecting those at the bottom because that's where the most political noise will come from. But the realization that out of, for instance, our utility, 9.8 million customers today, the industrial and the small commercial will account to about 70%, close to 75% of their revenues. So it's really striking the right balance between who moves the needle from a demand standpoint for the utility in terms of the revenue standpoint, but also being able to meet the social policy objective of the tariff review process as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Go ahead, Simran.
Yeah, thanks. Just one quick sort of input. I mean, since the discussion is happening between 3 different countries, and I think affordability context for the 3 will be very, very different, right? In India, we have an average energy consumption about 3,000 units per year, and electricity stands, if I'm not wrong, about 1,200 units a year, right? And so people at the bottom of the pyramid are really essentially not consuming anything at all, like, which might not be very different from US. I'm sure Kenya will share a lot of similarities with India, maybe much lower in terms of energy consumption. I don't know the numbers, but maybe Daniel can throw some light there.
Yeah, but I think just picking up, if you'll allow me, on Simran's point, is an interesting position that we didn't establish in Kenya, that those at the bottom of the pyramid, those who are on the lifeline tariff that are being cushioned, and actually those who have the most sensitivity, both from a political standpoint and in terms of agitation as a populace, they spend more on the telco side. I think Kenya has also been really at the cutting edge in terms of telecommunication, mobile money, and your bank is your mobile phone. So at the end of the day, you find those people spending more on data than they do on electricity. But still, the political sensitivity around electricity tariffs, and this is one of the areas that we're trying to be able to sensitize and socialize both the political class and the population, is that those at the bottom of the pyramid, even with the push for more subsidies to those at the bottom, in the other sectors, they're actually spending more than what they're spending to pay the utility based on the tariff that we've approved as a regulator, which we found to be very interesting.
Very interesting. Diana, go ahead.
Daniel, I find this kind of notion of the lifeline tariff so very interesting and very novel. Can you tell me where the political pressure is coming from? So if this is socialized because of political pressure, where is that? Where are you feeling it most kind of on the regulatory side?
I think, Diana, it's there's always political pressure when a tariff review is coming up every 3-year, 4-year cycle. There's a lot of pressure to lower tariffs irrespective of the costs and irrespective of the tariff review methodology, and passing on a prudently incurred costs. So I think the conversation we as a regulator face, and the challenge the regulators face, is how to ensure that you have a financially sustainable sector, but ensuring all the prudently incurred costs are recovered, and the utilities and your generators have continue to be going concerns traded off against the political imperative by the politicians to keep tariffs low for their own political expediency. And that is why we've had to be able to come up and be able to model this and show them cost comparators, that those you are seeking to protect and those you're saying at the bottom of the pyramid actually could pay a bit more, as opposed to then having either a direct or indirect subsidy, because you can see how much they're spending in other spheres of the economy.
Yeah, very interesting. And I know, the fixed charge conversation has been one that's very active in the US as well, and that debate is playing out in California. And Simran, just to acknowledge your point, the consumption thresholds are very different, but the debates are very similar. And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to bring out through this conversation as well. So let me move to the next question, which is let's look at this from the people's perspective. what kind of issues have they been facing with regard to electricity affordability, and especially those on the low income bands, and also sort of placing this within the context of how certain costs are being socialized, for example, cost of the energy transition, costs of more clean energy coming on the grid, which is happening in more higher income categories. How are those kind of costs trickling down to some of the customers, and what kind of issues are they facing? Daniel, let's start with you this time.
Okay, I know that's not the question you've asked, but I think because it's a global north, global south discussion, I think I'll start with my pet subject, because I think one big issue is an issue of access. Because even before we have a conversation, the affordability question, there's an access issue, because I think the global south has a big challenge with access. So even affordability is not a conversation you will have if you do not have the access. I think that's really one of the big issues that really needs a front and center discussion around access. But when we go back again to the affordability question, one of the big issues is energy poverty, when you have people who have the access, but they are not consuming as much. One of the issues would be their per capita income. They don't have the money because they have to split their money between what are basic goods, and then they see electricity to be, in some cases, even a luxury good. So it is not a primary order question, it's a secondary order question. The other issue is an issue of public awareness. When you talk to the different bands, even within the consumer category, customers don't really know which band, and when you move from one threshold to the other, particularly like in Kenya, when you move from the lifeline tariff to the next category band within the domestic category, then your tariff becomes higher and they don't have an appreciation on where you fit. The other is also an issue of the ability to then have an understanding, particularly on the ratings of appliances and energy efficiency. So when you go to a lot of the areas that have been connected in the informal settlements in Kenya, it's a connection which has cost, on average, in Kenya, if you're within 600 meters of a transformer, it's about 15,000 Kenya shillings, which is about $110, $120 to connect. But that customer then is only having one bulb just to light the room, and it's on for 2 or 3 hours between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. But for you to then tilt or move the needle when it comes to demand, you need them to have awareness of appliances, from having one bulb to having an iron box, to then having a microwave, eventually having a fridge, which will then move up demand. But also they need to have an appreciation, one, on matters energy efficiency, and also affordability. Again, question comes into play to be able to drive demand. So for customers, really, it's an issue of affordability, public education and awareness and information, and ability to have access to the appliances as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Simran.
So fortunately in India, I think access is now less of an issue, especially at the household level. There will be, access issues in for agriculture supply and maybe for other applications. But I think at least the government claims close to 100% of the villages are electrified. Now, villages also have hamlets and new habitats, which means some households may have been left out. Some households may have been electrified to solar and DRE, etc. So access is after 2014, sort of electrification has happened on a mission mode, and we've close to 100% electrification in the country. Right now, in terms of what is affordability, Vivek, you and I come from an NxSS sort of background, and we know that for reliable and quality supply of electricity, people are actually willing to pay a lot more than what a electricity connection and electricity supply, the electrons that carry cost, right? So it's a complex issue. I think from an Indian perspective, it's also a historical issue, right? India today has a lot of I think it's energy sufficient. The deficit is very small and seasonal, if at all. But the legacy issues of supply and quality of infrastructure have been there, right? I would also contest that historically, not in the current context, definitely, electricity consumers in the rural markets and the bottom of the pyramid have not really been, treated in a dignified manner, so to speak. Right? What are they going to consume? Let's just give them something to, a bulb is good enough for them, and if they can charge a mobile, that's enough for them, right? If they get 4 hours of electricity, that's fine. Then that 6 and 7 is fine. So I mean, I know of cases where farmers, for example, have to repair their motor and spend 15 to 20,000 every month, right? Which is lot more than what a real cost of electricity will cost them, right? So why should that farmer be paying to the utility for such poor supply quality, which is 6 hours, not just 6 hours, but also in terms of voltage fluctuation, etc., pretty bad quality. That's a complex issue, I think, and an affordability debate becomes very gray. I'm not an economist, so I don't know what's the real number which will define the affordability. But of course, it's also very politically charged, right? I think the past many decades, political electricity has been sort of the easiest, doldrums to give away because systemically you can also defer the cost. And that is something where utilities and the state governments have really paid heavily. Maybe we can discuss more, right? So yeah.
Just quick follow-up, Simran, and Madison, this kind of applies to you as well when you respond. Could you also contextualize this in the context of public utilities versus private utilities? There's this notion that when utilities become private, their service improves and it improves for everyone. And Madison, and when it comes to you, it's a similar conversation on IOUs versus municipal utilities versus cooperatives. How does affordability get reflected similarly or differently in that context? Simran first.
Sure. I'll take a few minutes for that. It's a little complex subject, very close to heart, right? See, structurally, we have to understand that business and operation risk between generation, distribution, and transmission are very, very different, right? Distribution network, because of the by inherently having a very dispersed network, right, and having sort of people-facing, consumer-facing sort of business carry a high amount of operational risk. So the infrastructure is also very dispersed, hard to maintain, etc., right? But what they also carry is social and political risk, which we have been discussing, right? But more than that, they also carry the demand risk, right? So distribution utilities in India have to enter long-term PPAs to ensure there is sufficiency in terms of electricity supply capacity to meet not just the current demand but future demand. Now, sector works in a manner that it takes typically 10 years to 12 years from planning to implementation for a power plant and transmission lines to come in, right? So 10 years down the line, what is going to be the real demand? Although, forecasting techniques are improving a lot, but it's still up for a toss, right? Often it's also sort of shaped by the political discourse. We are going by double-digit GDP, etc., etc. So, historically, those projections have paved into over forecasting of in terms of capacity requirements and energy growth, etc. And in the long run, underutilization of assets, right? So that's a complexity where public utilities have very little sort of autonomy to really manage those risks, and it end up being sort of dictated in the political corridors behind the doors, right? Now, the challenge, the debate of public versus private, right? In India, at least, there is no evidence. I'm sure there are advocates who will differ for me, but there's no evidence which says that a privatization leads to success and increase in efficiency, right? There have been instances, enough cases, whether it was twice privatization failure in Odisha, AES, Reliance, and even now Tata is struggling, right? On the other hand, even Tata Power in Delhi, for instance, was struggling until the current government came in and gave 200 units of subsidy, which meant that a lot of the pilferage the consumer categories were taken away, and there's a smaller sort of consumer segments that they had to manage, right? On the other hand, there have also been cases where public utilities have really performed very well. Now, Kerala is one unique example, which is not even unbundled, where it's a state electricity board, where transmission, generation, and distribution sit within a single entity, right? There is Chandigarh, there's Gujarat, which are really, really performing well, both in terms of operational efficiency and also their fiscal management. So for us, I think from what we understand, these are deeper governance issues which dictate the success of a utility, whether public or private. And also sometimes the consumer mix does contribute a lot in terms of the complexity of the distribution business, right? Delhi, Chandigarh are essentially, very urban elite areas with high energy consumption, easier to manage versus, Rajasthan, which is sparsely populated, very remote pockets, a big number of a big majority, decent, or I'll say decent majority at least, are living in energy poverty and real poverty, so to speak.
Thanks, Simran. Madison, same question to you.
Thank you. I'm going to start really quick with the issues that people face regarding electricity affordability. And I wanted to circle back to a point that Daniel made around access, and that being like a basis under which we need to be looking at this. In New York and in other locations around the country, energy cost burden is a very pervasive issue. And in New York State, a customer is considered energy cost burden if they pay more than 6% of their annual monthly income on electricity costs. And in a lot of cases, this is resulting in customers needing to choose between putting food on their tables or keeping the lights on. And this issue really dovetails with the cost of the energy transition itself, in that electrification often leads to cost shifting, especially in New York, where most buildings are set up where landlords pay for heat and tenants pay for the electric bills. And as these buildings begin to electrify, the cost of heating can shift onto tenants without a correlating decrease in their rent. And electricity is so expensive in New York City that it can at times be more expensive than gas, depending on the efficiency of a building itself. How this dovetails with the energy cost burden is that we see in a lot of instances that the customers that are energy cost burdened are the same customers that are living in buildings that need energy efficient systems, and they're often some of the last to receive these upgrades. I also just wanted to touch on the fact that another thing we're dealing with is kind of the gas system death spiral, and the idea that like as the energy transition accelerates, more and more customers are going to be moving away from the gas system, which means that the increasing like costs are going to increase for individual customers because there are fewer customers to socialize all of these costs across.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly a governance issue, as Simran pointed out. I think a big portion of the historical roots of the affordability problem lies with the fact that in the United States, public utilities are essentially private companies that are offering essential services to the general public. And that configuration presents a very clear internal conflict that's kind of three parts. So you have the utility that must balance its obligation to provide the shareholders a reasonable opportunity to recover those costs, while also maintaining a reliable energy system and also ensuring that the charges the customers are being charged are just and reasonable. And these things are at odds.
You have to tell us more, Madison. Kind of unpack that a little bit more, because I think that those tensions are precisely like where some of these issues are most interesting and really coming to a head.
Absolutely. I think not to skip down to something I was going to say in another question, but a great example would be the recently proposed and unadopted New York Heat Affordability Transition Act, the HEAT Act. That act was trying to get after reducing the costs that are being placed on customers by removing the natural gas utility obligation to serve rule. So in the beginning of energy regulation in the US, these companies were monopolies, and there were issues with discriminatory policies whereby certain individuals based off color and gender were not being given either the same energy rates or access at all. And so the obligation to serve rule comes into play because it requires these gas companies to provide service to any new customer that requests it. But by operation, the cost of interconnecting these new customers is then borne by existing natural gas customers within what's called the new customer connections budget. And while it's intended to protect access to energy, the obligation to serve rule is now being leveraged by utilities to argue against reductions in their customer connections budget, spending on marketing, and all of these things contribute to monthly bills. And it's kind of under the guise of, well, we need to ensure we have a reliable system. The mandates require us to offer gas to anyone who requests it, and well, there's nothing that we can do now, failing to consider that it's really a missed opportunity to start thinking about and implementing a holistic approach to decarbonizing and winding down the gas system.
Thank you so much, Madison. In the time we have remaining, I want to get to the meaty third question, which is what strategies have been tried, whether they're policy strategies, whether they're strategies that utilities are employing to really address these affordability issues. We've already covered a couple of them, the lifeline tariff, different types of cross-subsidization. But are there other things that are being tried that could be replicated as successful strategies in other contexts? Madison, let's start with you this time. You're muted.
Sorry, I would say a very successful program is the federally funded Low-Income Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP. And at the federal level, this is a block grant administered by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, and it's designed to provide eligible low-income customers financial grants to help assist with home heating. And the way that this works is that New York State, through its Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, or OTDA, they apply for and receive HEAP funding from the federal government, and then they administer that funding through the New York State specific HEAP plan. And this is a very unique program in that these grants do not have to be repaid by customers, and eligibility and benefits are based on 4 factors, which is income, household size, your primary heating source, which must be electric, natural gas, oil, coal, wood, propane, kerosene, and corn, I think is another. And there must be in the household a presence of a member who is under 6 or over the age of 60. And I think this is a program that could certainly be replicated in that it serves to provide help for customers in 4 separate ways. There's a regular HEAP assistance, which serves households that pay directly for their heat based on the actual usage. There's an emergency HEAP that is available to customers under certain conditions. For instance, if you're a customer with a life-threatening need that you require electricity for, it helps you make sure that you're not having your electricity turned off. There's also cooling assistance, which is a one-time benefit to assist customers in paying for the installation and purchase of things like fans or air conditioning. And there's also a program that provides benefits to customers to fund replacements for furnaces, boilers, and other direct heating equipment in their homes. And that's definitely one program. If I can quickly touch on one more that I think is important, at the state level, energy affordability policies are something that is very important to the cost decrease. So in 2016, New York launched its first energy affordability policy, which sought to limit the energy costs for New Yorkers to no more than 6% of their pre-tax income, which is that energy cost burden threshold I had mentioned previously. And this 6% policy was formally adopted by the Public Service Commission, and it is in part being integrated into the reviews of rate setting, but there's definitely more that can be done.
Thank you. Madison. I'm sure there are more that we could get into, but I know this is an introductory conversation. So, Daniel, what about in Kenya?
I think in Kenya, the affordability question, there has been a big issue first on the generation side, and I think some of this has been taken out of context, particularly on the tariffs for the generators, particularly the independent power producers. A lot of that is taken out of context because of the cost of financing and also just the time at which the power purchase agreements were signed. So there's a big question on affordability in terms of ability of the utility to pay for what is perceived to be high tariffs. The big question that is also asked, particularly on the financing side and the return and the issues of risk allocation, has been the question of country risk. And the cost of financing, which is a big issue in terms of affordability. And this is at a macro level. But in terms of the customer, one of the initiatives that has been run by the government in Kenya has been not to pass on the capex cost of transmission. The transmission company is a utility 100% owned by the government of Kenya. So government has been financing transmission through the fiscus, through either one funds coming out of the government's budget, or the other has been through borrowed facilities from DFIs from other countries, either concessional or commercial, that sits on government's balance sheet that is not passed on to the consumers, so that then to keep the costs of power low. But then again, also other than the where we talk about the lifeline tariff on the domestic side, there has been a strategy called a Kenya National Electrification Strategy that talks to where do we go, what are the lowest hanging fruits in terms of lowest costs to achieve maximum impact in terms of number of people that have been reached by new connections. But I think also that has also been an issue which has also had a downside, particularly around a very fast accelerated growth of connections from about 2 million customers around 2012 to about 9.8 million customers today, who, as I said earlier on, only on that one bulb, which can also be a double-edged sword. The worst practice, I know you've not asked about the other practice, which is either direct or indirect subsidies, which from where we sit as a regulator is not ideal as well. But it's not that it hasn't happened. We have had a subsidy in the past, but then the issue of cost reflectivity has become a big concern for us from where we sit as a regulator.
Okay. And Simran.
Right. So I think the key instruments we already talked about. There are cross subsidies, there are direct subsidies. Lifeline access definition exists in India also. Beyond that, I think so when the last mission mode electrification happened in India, the infrastructure and the extension of infrastructure to the last mile was largely subsidized by the state and the central government. Right. Beyond that, we have had, so India was one of the quickest nations to transition in terms of from incandescent CFL lighting to LED lighting, and that happened in the PM's Suryodaya Yojana, if I'm not wrong, where large scale procurement of LED bulbs happened, and the pricing sort of came down from $5 to $7 a bulb to less than $1 a bulb. Unfortunately, such missions have not transitioned to other appliances. So specifically, fans is a big potential within the Indian landscape, and we have local homegrown technology of BLDC, and which are really efficient, have been deployed in the NxSS distributed solar applications, as we are aware. Beyond that, I think there has been effort on decentralized solar also. There's a recent announcement, a very ambitious one, on Pradhan Mantri PM's solar scheme, which intends to target small houses, particularly which are with a capacity of 1 to 3 kilowatt, and if it's sort of supported by capital upfront subsidy, right? So while it might not reach the poorest of the poor, I think it will still sort of reduce energy generation costs for the lower middle income categories if they are able to adopt it, right? But adoption is subject to reliable availability of electricity grid, especially during the day hours. Otherwise, the systems, as we know, gets largely work when grid is available, right? Similarly, in agriculture also, there has been a lot of push for solar pumps, and particularly also on feeder solarization of agriculture feeders to reduce the cost of supply. So these are, I think, largely key initiatives. There are programs on efficient cooling, etc., but are not done on the scale, the potential that is there.
Great. Thank you. I mean, there are so many threads that from all of your conversations that I want to pull, but we have 4 minutes remaining, and I want to get to at least a few questions. So the first, maybe we'll I'll take the other question next. First, is it gets back to this socializing the cost of the electricity transition. So, how much of the current issues could be rectified by distributed generation? Madison, maybe you could respond to this as well. This is a conversation that's rapidly unfolding in California, where I think right now about 20% of the customers or more in some of the utilities have rooftop solar. There's been a big question of how rates are increasing for other customers. So how can distributed generation fit into this conversation?
If you don't mind, I'd love to use New York as an example of the distributed generation problem. So yes, I definitely think it's one solution, but not the complete solution. Distributed generation in New York allows customers to have the solar panels on their house, their cost of electricity is decreased, and in turn, the utility takes hold of the renewable energy credit that is associated with the solar, right? These programs are only efficient if the customers receive the bill credit that they are due on time. And in New York, there's a very pervasive issue with this, with some of the utilities not giving customers their bill credits when they are due, many being in the arrears, and that really undermines the role of distributed generation and customers, feeling that this is something that's worth investing in. If they're not going to be able to have the benefits that they're promised, then there are issues with uptake and interest.
Thanks, Madison. Simran, I know you wanted to come in on this question as well.
Yeah, sure. Distributed generation can mean a lot of things. It can mean an off-grid system. It can mean a microgrid or mini-grid. It could also mean substation level integrated, community solar systems, etc., which can range from few hundred kilowatts to few megawatts, to rooftop systems, which can again range from few kilowatts to few megawatts, right? We've done analysis for Rajasthan, where we know that compared to large-scale utility, the distribution utilities can save about ₹1.70 per unit of electricity in terms of avoided transmission costs, avoided transmission losses, avoided distribution losses, right? Now, if we are going to promote distributed generation, it's a paradigm shift in planning, right? It will, and India is sort of known to be very good in terms of centralized schemes. Decentralized ecosystem building requires a long-term political vision and systems evolution vision, which is difficult to generate in any heterogeneous community, in any heterogeneous society, especially which adversities are very high, right? But let's suppose if that is to happen, what it would if we are to imagine that, right? India has 650,000 villages, right? So and getting land for on an average a megawatt of solar per village should not be a hard task, right? So we're talking about a potential of 650 gigawatts of solar, which is much past the 2030 target of 500 gigawatts of solar. So there's enough potential, far more than that, which we could achieve through decentralized generation. What would also mean a lot of transmission costs will be avoided, a lot of land acquisition for transmission right of way, a lot of destruction of forests could be avoided, which will also mean that there are a lot of investments that will need to happen instead of transmission and distribution, right? Which will again increase the quality of supply, improve the efficiency of the overall systems, so reducing utility losses, hopefully improving affordability also, and most importantly, it will create a lot of jobs at the last point, right? So it potentially can really change the social economic landscape of the country. But again, it requires a very long-term vision and requires a very systems approach. Unlikely to happen.
Right. Thanks, Simran. And in the interest of time, Daniel, you get the last word on this.
Thank you. I think distributed energy, particularly from a global south standpoint in Kenya, where we've moved, just to use the Kenya example, access from 20% to 75%, just slightly over 75% in 10 years. The last 25th percentile, in our mind, will only be solved through distributed energy, particularly in a country where the capex investment, particularly to extend transmission and distribution lines, is costly. We have the lowering of cost of technology, particularly on the solar side, on the VRE side, wind turbines, and where you have communities in areas where it would be not economically viable to extend the grid, then distributed energy then becomes a big opportunity. Again, in a country like Kenya, where you have quite a bit of hydro resources, and particularly small hydro resources, and largely small towns with not very big loads, then again, distributed energy will play a very big part from where we sit. I think that really is the conversation that we want to have, particularly for a country like Kenya. As I said early on, we've operated a single buyer model. We are now actualizing the principle of open access. We'll then have multiple distributors coming on board, and an opportunity then to increase competition. And when you make competition work in electricity, even other than really having a conversation around subsidies, direct or indirect subsidies, but just introducing competition, then that will then have a big benefit on the cost side and also choice from a consumer standpoint.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. And I'm so glad you mentioned open access, because most likely that's going to be the next topic of this conversation a month from now on the potentials and pitfalls of electricity open access. So that's all we have time for today. Let me express my sincere gratitude to all of the speakers to taking time. Again, for some of you, it's very late, so I really appreciate it. And this is certainly only a starting point. I know we'll be having much more pointed discussions going forward. So thank you, Simran, Madison, Daniel, and Diana. And thanks also to Vincent, Amanda, and Andrew Kamau, and others who provided support in putting this together. So like I said, stay tuned for the next conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.